baby boomers.
I used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going on?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
You could have given me 100 guesses and I wouldn't have guessed that you're watching curling.
It probably made me a lot more libertarian. It probably made me think, oh, these government officials, they're really not very good at their jobs. Maybe they don't have our best interest in mind. It kind of opened the eyes of a lot of people to see, like, what is the government doing? The recommendation is that we should think of voting as a civic duty and think of voting as a collective action problem, which is none of us individually has a strong incentive to vote, but collectively we're all better off if everybody votes.
And I'm just going to say, I want to be Antony when I grow up. And now, here are James and Emily. Good morning, Shanna.
Good morning, James.
How are you?
I am great. A little chilly, but I'm great.
For our listeners, normally I would say good morning, Emily, but Emily is at a conference in Washington, D.C., and so Dr. Shanna Padgham from the Oklahoma City Community College agreed to fill in, and I'm very grateful that you did.
My pleasure.
And this is a good week to do it. First week of classes for us, right? How did that go? Good?
Fine. I feel like I've been at a sprint since this whole entire week, but it has been great. I'm encouraged with the students that we're going to have. It's going to be a good semester. And
very good.
And it's going well for you?
Yeah, my first day of classes went very, very well. My concern is it's all downhill from there. It's lots of people in the classroom and all of that. And then, by spring break, not so many.
Right,
so, yeah.
right.
But no, it went great. Lots of stuff going on this week. We had a new presidential inauguration, right? Did you watch the inaugural address?
I was out of the country.
Okay, good excuse.
Yes, it was a good excuse. It kind of serendipitously turned out that way. I've, of course, taken in a lot since then, but I was not watching it live. But I'm pretty familiar with how everything went down.
It was classic Trump. I mean, basically, although I distinctly think I remember the phrase manifest destiny showing up in that speech. Is that right?
I believe so. And,
along with other things.
That's really empowering to feel
really
like
just kind of stood out to me.
This was really meant to be. And, fate, couldn't have, fate will be what it is, and there's anything we can do to fight against it. And so this is really all how it's supposed to be, I suppose. And I guess that's one way to. I should start that with my students. And this is just you can't fight it. It is.
You can't fight it. Yeah. And then, of course, I was struck that apparently Trump and Biden did agree on one thing, which was we can just summarily amend the Constitution by dictate now. Right. Biden declaring that there's been a 28th Amendment, Trump declaring that the 14th Amendment doesn't really mean what it says. I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, it made me think, you remember The Office when Michael Scott, he was like, I declare bankruptcy. And he thinks that's like all that it takes. And I'm like, and we're just like, I declare the 28th Amendment. Nothing seems to matter anymore. We're just going to throw things at the wall and see if it sticks. Because sometimes it does. Right. And I think on the 28th Amendment, we'll mostly just get a chuckle out of that. I think we're going to see a lot of legal arguments against this birthright citizenship and executive orders versus the Constitution. So there's a lot more that remains to be seen on that issue.
That's right. Well, listen, we have a great guest on the program today, Dr. Antony Fowler from the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago is joining us. He is, in fact, the Sidney A. Stein Jr. Professor of Public Policy. His research applies econometric methods for causal inference. For those who don't understand what that means, he uses math to explain why things happen. And in relation to questions in political science. So He has a particular emphasis on elections and political representation. His research interests include unequal political participation, electoral selection and incentives, political polarization, and the credibility of empirical research. He serves as the editor-in-chief of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, is a co-author of Thinking Clearly with Data, and co-host of one of my absolute favorite podcasts, the Not Another Politics podcast. Dr. Fowler earned his PhD in government from Harvard University and his undergraduate degree in biology, of all things, from the Massachusetts.
Some of us start in the sciences.
I guess you did too, right?
I sure did. Yeah. Then we make our way over here.
Right. We figure out it's a better science. Political science is a better science.
Or we can at least argue about it.
But he earned his undergraduate degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. At Harris, he has served as the director of undergraduate studies and the editor of the Center for Effective Government's primer series on political reform. Anthony, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Hi, James. Hi, Shannon. It's so good to talk to you. It's such a kind introduction. I'm flattered that you're a fan of Not Another Politics podcast. And I want to make one more office reference. There was the time that Pam made herself the office manager just by kind of making that up out of thin air. So that illustrates that sometimes this does work. Sometimes you can just change the Constitution through assertion. So you never quite know how these things are going to shake out.
That's true. For every thing, there is an office reference. I am sure.
I come from a probably slightly different generation. For me, everything has a Seinfeld reference, but I get it. Yeah, right. We all have those programs. All right. We got some icebreaker questions we're going to run you through real quick, and then we'll get into the meat of the interview. So our podcast is called Not My Generation. So we like to look at things sometimes through a generational lens. So that's the first question. Millennial, Gen X, Gen Z. I know you're not a baby boomer, but where do you fall in that range?
I am technically a millennial. I don't feel any particular kinship with millennials necessarily. Not that I dislike them. I mean, my father was in his 50s when he had me, and he got me started playing golf when I was a kid. And so I became friends with people of all generations. And so I've always gotten along with older people and younger people. And so the word millennial doesn't have much meaning to me, but I am technically a millennial.
What are you currently reading, watching, or listening to?
The honest answer is I've been watching a lot of competitive curling, which is just something I love. And that's a fun thing if this is prime season for competitive curling, middle of the winter, it's a fun thing to do. And when you don't want to think about American politics. My wife is an author, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I, of course, love reading her books. She just had a book come out called X Marks the Spot, spelled EX marks the spot. And so it's a really fun adventure book. There's a young woman who goes on a treasure hunt throughout Taiwan, and she has to work with her ex. It's a very fun book. Just came out, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. I love all of her books. Her name is Gloria Chow.
Okay, great,
nice. Excellent. Now we've got another book to put on the list.
I like it.
Yeah,
I like
right?
it. You could have given me 100 guesses, and I wouldn't have guessed that you'd say you're watching curling. But, that's really
Obviously,
interesting.
he doesn't realize we're right in the middle of the playoffs and all of NFL playoffs.
Right.
All right. So, all right. What is your favorite social media platform?
I think none. Is none an answer? I'm not on social media at all.
That is the most common answer we get, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The quarterly. You mentioned I'm an editor of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, and the QJPS does have a Twitter page. And we essentially just post when there's a new paper that comes out. So I'll post on Twitter when there's a new paper that comes out. And that is the extent of my engagement on social media. I feel old. I still kind of miss the days of blogs where you would just subscribe to blogs and and I still subscribe to some blogs and I enjoy some Substack writers and whatnot. So I like those. I miss the old days of message boards. Like you'd find a message board of people interested in the same thing as you. I love Golf Club Atlas, which is where golf nerds get together and talk about golf history and golf architecture, and it's very low tech. So I like that. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter or any of the other ones.
Well, I was listening to your bio and I was thinking this guy must have like 36 hours in the day while the rest of us have 24 because he's got a lot going on here. But I think that you're probably using your time wisely by avoiding social media and can claw back some of that to more productive ends. So, and you probably live longer by just avoiding social media. There's nothing good there. There's nothing worth having, but alas,
I don't know. I've made some good connections through social media.
It's 10% good, maybe 10% good, but you got to have a lot of discernment to weed through all the nonsense.
Yeah,
and so I think you have that discernment, James. What's your favorite pastime or hobby? I think I can make a guess now, but I'll go ahead and let you say it.
Yeah, I think I already mentioned both of them. I think it's golf in the summertime and curling in the wintertime. Those are my two obscure hobbies. I love them both. And they're fun. They're athletic. They're strategic. They're good for cerebral type people. They both involve some strategy and backward induction, and they're athletic. So I love those two sports. I love watching them. I love playing them. And I haven't been watching much of the NFL. So I'm sorry, James.
That's all right. It's all right. I'm going to have to now investigate curling a little bit more, I think.
I think the Winter Olympics brought that to us. They're like, are those Swiffers? What's happening out there?
It's similar. When I Swiffer, I try to practice my curling sweep.
There you go.
It's
multi-purpose.
The last of these kind of icebreaker questions. What's one event in your lifetime that's had the most impact on your personal political views or perspectives?
I usually try to avoid talking publicly about my personal political views, but you asked. So, I grew up, being a millennial, the Bush-Gore election was a formative moment. I remember those debates very well. I remember the virtually tied election and all of the uncertainty around that as just being very interesting. Of course, I had my views about Bush and Gore, but I remember almost becoming interested in elections and politics during that period, almost as an outside observer, just like what exactly is going to happen. The choice was so stark. The style of the candidates was so stark. And then Bush obviously ended up winning, and that really corresponded with a rise of the importance of Christian conservatives in our culture, in our society, in our politics. So that was really interesting. And then 9/11 comes right after that. And so that was obviously a very formative experience. And probably a lot of my political views as a youth were kind of partly in rejection to that moment. And then I know you just asked for one, but I think it's also impossible not to mention the pandemic, which I think for all of us, I think regardless of your age, even if you weren't coming of age during the pandemic, I think it was just such a big moment that it's likely to shape people's political views for a very long time. And for me personally, I think, and probably a lot of people, it probably made me a lot more libertarian. It probably made me think, oh, these government officials, they're really not very good at their jobs. Maybe they don't have our best interest in mind all the time. It kind of opened the eyes of a lot of people to see, like, what is the government doing and how, so anyway, that's fascinating. I'm sure we can come back to that, but those are two big moments that come to mind.
Yeah. I think of the pandemic, and I think of how, it shapes people's perspectives, but in very different ways. And often, that might be due to their personal, if they had a family member who got really sick or passed away, or they felt, they were in a job that required them to get vaccinated and they didn't like that, so that kind of the way it forms our opinions can have very different impacts based on how we interacted with that whole environment.
I think, like, generationally speaking, which, their podcast theme is that, when I try to talk to my students and we talk about 9/11 and they tell me they weren't alive for it, I'm like, you've stunned me. I don't understand how you don't have context for this. I'll try to explain to you in the same way that our parents would be like, where were you when JFK was assassinated? I'm like, I don't really have context, but the pandemic is helpful to be like, we all have stake in this in some way, even if we saw it very differently, but it makes it much more approachable to across generations say, like, I know that you're carrying something and you have views on the government as a result of this collective event that none of us could escape. So that is heavily impacting.
I think that was a shocking moment for all of us, college instructors, when our undergraduates, or they're all now born after 2000. And it's just very hard to relate to them. I still, just in class the other day, I showed them the picture of Frank Zappa, John Denver, and Dee Snider testifying before the U.S. Senate. And not only do they not recognize those people in the photos, they've never even heard of those people's names. And they were a bit before my generation too. But it's just kind of amazing to try to relate to students who have none of the same shared experience as you, or almost none of them. Yeah.
I tried once on the first day of class to be like, you know what? I'm going to, instead of bringing you to my Seinfeld and Office references, I'm going to try to come to you. And I asked them what they were interested in. And I read all their responses and I was like, absolutely not. I'm not going to start watching anime and listening to this music that I don't think is great. And too much for me. I'm not that great of a professor.
All right. Well, let's get into talking about you and some of the research in your podcast. I'm going to let Shanna jump in here first.
So first question, especially given that you also pursued more of the, what we kind of call the hard sciences like I did and ended up in this political science world, like why political science? What attracted you to the discipline? And if you were visiting with students who were trying to decide on a major, what would you tell them?
In my case, it was very idiosyncratic. I was always interested in elections and politics. Probably those Bush-Gore debates were a big moment for me, just becoming interested in elections and politics. But I was mostly interested in as an outside observer. I was not a really strong partisan. I was not working on campaigns. I was just interested. And I majored in biology in college, but I took a lot of fun classes on the side, including political science and economics. And I had great professors. I was at MIT where there weren't a lot of undergraduates doing political science. And so I think the professors were excited. Oh, there's some undergrad who wants to talk to us about political science. And they kind of treated me like I was a graduate student, even when I was an undergrad. So they were inviting me to seminars and working with me on projects. And so I got a great head start in some ways in the field. And that was really fun. And I just really liked it. Like the professors, ended up applying to graduate school in political science. If I had to do it over again, I don't know if I would do the same thing. I don't know, but I've enjoyed it. I love what I do. And I think I would encourage students to just keep an open mind, because you never really know for sure what's going to interest you. The world is going to change in unforeseeable ways in your lifetime. And so you might as well challenge yourself, do whatever you can to improve your own critical thinking skills, take a broad set of classes, and keep an open mind because your interests might change.
Absolutely. So how do you define political science? Like, what do political scientists research and why is it important?
In its best form, ideally, political science is the objective scientific study of politics. And politics includes a lot. Politics includes all kinds of collective decision making. It includes both voters and policymakers and elected bureaucrats and elected officials at every level of government. So it essentially is the study of collective decision making in some form or another. And obviously, politics affect our lives tremendously. So being able to study it objectively and scientifically is important, to be able to just understand how it works, understand what's going on. And ideally, we can even use those insights to design better institutions so that we can make better collective decisions and make people's lives better. So in its ideal form, political science is a great thing. Of course, in practice, you probably know a lot of the shortcomings of the field of political science. We don't have to go into all of those. That's true of every scientific field. Things become politicized and things become maybe not as objective as scientific as they should. But I think studying politics is a really fascinating, interesting, and important thing. And I think that was part of what drew me to it was these questions are really interesting. They're really important. And they're really hard to answer. You can't just go into the lab and, with your Petri dish and design a simple little experiment. You've got to come up with a really creative way of collecting new data and thinking about this problem in a way other people haven't thought about it before. So that was partly what drew me to the study of politics. These questions are really important and interesting and also really challenging. And so we haven't made a ton of field progress as a field, I would say, as political scientists, but that's also part of the appeal is it's such an interesting, challenging field to be in, to try to understand the political process.
I have a wife who is a computer scientist and a data scientist. And every now and then she'll poke me. She'll be like, political science isn't a real science. And we'll go round and round. And I'm like, it's the most challenging science because we don't have a lab room where we can do all of our research in and such. And then I remind her that, the engineers don't consider computer science a real science either. And so, it seems like there's this hierarchy of who's a real science or not. I love the field of political science. I think it's so diverse and we can explore and incorporate research from other disciplines into what we do. It just gives it a flexibility to understand the world. I like to tell students, we're studying processes and institute, but we're really studying people and how people organize to make those collective decisions, right? And at the end of the day, we're studying how people do this and which ways of organization which ways of decision making produce better outcomes, right? And I really like that about the discipline. All right. Well, your podcast, Not Another Politics Podcast, focuses on political science research, and you and your co-host interview researchers regarding the work that they have published or that they're working on, and then you co-host and you discuss that work, which I love the format. I think it really works very, very well. As I've said, it's one of my favorite podcasts to listen to because I feel like I learned something when I'm listening to it, something that I can take away and maybe apply to something that I'm doing. Can you take a few minutes and discuss some of the research that you have covered that you have found, the most interesting? These might be novel approaches to questions or unique questions, or even research you think might have the most impact on the discipline. So from all the folks you've talked to and the research that you reviewed, what stood out to you?
Sure. Yeah, I've really enjoyed doing the podcast. It started off as just a simple little experiment. Like, would anybody listen to this thing if we talked about political science papers? I don't think any of us planned that we would still be doing it more than 4 years later and more than 100 episodes later. But here we are. It's been a lot of fun. We, as you can imagine, we cover a very broad range of topics because the as a field, political science is a pretty broad field, and there's a huge. So we cover things like counterterrorism. We just covered a topic including how these blockchain communities govern themselves using what do they even call it? Liquid voting. So we cover a very broad range of topics. Probably a topic that we come to a lot is elite polarization. Why is there so much elite polarization in American politics, especially when there isn't very much public polarization? I find that to be one of the most fascinating puzzles in American politics today. And so we've covered that topic from a wide range of angles. We just featured my colleague Daniel Moskowitz, who has a really interesting paper on congressional polarization, and he can show that a lot of the changes in congressional polarization have actually come from social and environmental policy, and you don't see them on economic policy, and you see them more for Republicans than for Democrats, but both parties are contributing. And so, I think just every time we add a little bit of new evidence to this, it kind of helps us understand this puzzle a little bit more. But I love coming back to that topic. One of my favorite and most memorable episodes was with Floyd Zhang, who studied the effects of a scientific journal endorsing a political candidate. So as you might remember, the journal Nature explicitly endorsed Biden in 2020. And he did an experiment and showed that if you show this endorsement to people, it has no effect on their vote choice, but it has a very negative effect on their perception of the journal Nature. And so I just thought that was a really fascinating, and not surprising, but really fascinating finding. And we had a really fun conversation around that, where we talked a lot about the general politicization of science and what to do about it. So we cover a lot of fun topics on the show. I really enjoy it. You can. There's more than 100 episodes. So if you're not interested in those topics, you can probably find some others that you'd be interested in.
I suspect the editors of Nature, that was not the outcome they were expecting from their endorsement per se. Yeah.
No, although they actually, after he published his paper, they wrote a reply, still kind of doubling down on here's why we still think we were right to have done this. And it was I think not very, it was misguided, I think, their response. But they don't think they had a come to Jesus moment where they said, oh, maybe we made a mistake and we violated our responsibility as editors of a scientific journal. So
I want to spend a few minutes discussing polarization. You mentioned it a while ago, and you've had several discussions on your podcast with researchers and your co-hosts on this topic. We had a brief email conversation about it as well. Let's start off. Let's define polarization for those who might not quite understand what we mean by that. And then if you would, discuss where you think kind of the common wisdom is wrong and where it might be right about polarization in the U.S. And then I want you to wrap up kind of talking about your findings from your 2024 paper in the Journal of Political Institutions and Political Economy that focused on the impact of partisan constituencies on congressional polarization. So there's a lot there, but let's define it and then talk about where you think where people are wrong and right about it.
Sure. I think there's not a really clear agreed upon definition. I think polarization as a concept is some notion about the amount of disagreement among a group, whether it's, the whole society or a group of elected officials. A common way that it's measured is to just measure kind of the average difference in opinion or positions between Democrats and Republicans. That's a strange measure because it's somewhat arbitrary who even calls themselves Democrats and Republicans, and you're ignoring people who aren't Democrats and Republicans, of which there are many. So there are different ways people try to measure it, but I think the idea is to get a sense of how much disagreement really is there over things like policy. Do we have a nice unimodal distribution where most people are somewhere close to the average, or are there two poles of people who disagree so strongly they can't even live in the same country? That's the kind of thing that people are interested in when they study polarization. And I think some of the interesting findings in that literature are that the elites are indeed very polarized, as you might expect. If you just tuned into Fox News or MSNBC, et cetera, you would infer that the elites are very polarized, and that seems the data is consistent with that. The flip side of that is that's not true at the public level. So among the general public, you mostly get, if you try to estimate people's policy positions, you get kind of a unimodal distribution of policy with most people pretty close to the mean, and a lot of moderates who are well to the right of Joe Biden and well to the left of Donald Trump. And they actually don't hate each other. They don't disagree on everything. They might disagree. They might be unhappy with both major political parties, but there's perhaps not as much public polarization as people think. So maybe we should stop there. Yeah, there was a lot there, but yeah.
I want to ask a question because I agree. In most of the research I've seen, there's not, when you look at like policy issues, there doesn't seem to be amongst the general public that kind of polarization that we're talking about that you see among elites, elected officials, party leaders, that kind of thing. There does seem to be, and maybe I'm misreading some of this, but there does seem to be a general, what we might call affective polarization, where increasingly Republicans and Democrats just don't like each other, even if they don't necessarily have hard disagreements on public policy. And I'm wondering, is that a subset of the public and not really, in other words, they're not elites per se, but maybe they're partisan activists. Maybe they're like the people who show up in primaries and vote all the time, or they're people who donate or whatnot. So can you talk a little bit about that and where that, because I hear and read a lot, I've written just a little bit on some of this about this kind of notion that Republicans and Democrats, even though they're not as far away on policy issues, really have become very disdainful of one another.
That is a common notion and a common claim in the academic literature. And I think there probably is some truth to that. My guess is that it's among a small set of really hyperactive, politically active people. So certainly there are people who have strong views. They might be ideologically extreme, and they also really hate the other side. A common way that we measure that is just these feeling thermometer questions. We ask, how warmly do you feel toward the Democratic Party and the Republican Party? And if you give really different answers to those questions, we kind of interpret that as affective polarization. But I don't know how strongly to interpret that. I think in the context of a political survey, one finding is that people, when they answer those questions, mostly think of elites. And so you might be saying, oh, I really don't like Mitch McConnell when you're thinking of Republicans. And so you say, I really don't feel warmly toward them. But then you go have dinner with your friend Steve, who's a Republican, and you don't think anything of it. You like Steve, and you can talk about politics with Steve, and you get along with him, and so forth. So I think that's one critique of that literature, is we maybe fixate too much on these measures, which could be an artifact of the survey, or it could be people are mostly thinking about elites when they answer these questions. I have one working paper where we did something very simple. We asked people, how do you feel about the other party? And then we follow up and we ask them, why do you feel the way that you do? We just ask them, like, why do you, to what extent do you have any negative feelings about the other party, and why? And in the follow-up question, a lot of people, more than 20% of people, kind of reject the premise of the question, and they say, like, I don't have any negative feelings toward members of the other party. So that's kind of an interesting finding in and of itself. And then among the people who give an answer, most people give kind of a policy answer. They mention values and ideology, and they say, well, I just kind of disagree with those people on, they don't say like these people are subhuman, or these people are, just like incapable of making decisions or something like that. They just say like, oh, we have different views on abortion, which is not unreasonable. So anyway, I feel like there's probably too much made of that literature, which is, yes, affective polarization is a thing, but I think it's probably overstated. And I think there are a lot of people who are politically moderate, they're ideologically moderate, they get along with people from the other side. Maybe they don't like the extremists and they don't like the leaders, but that doesn't come, they don't walk around thinking I'm a Democrat and I hate Republicans or vice versa.
Do you think there are pockets within the country? And I think I'm somewhat persuaded by your notion that, within a certain circles of American society, this polarization is higher, this affective polarization is higher than in others. Do you see, are there pockets? If I'm on a college campus, is there more of that than if I'm in the workplace? If I'm at a church, is there more or less of that than if I'm at a Rotary Club? I mean, where are the places where that might be more problematic than others?
I'm sure you're right that it does vary quite a bit across contexts and so forth. I don't think we have really good studies of that. That would be interesting to see both does it manifest itself differently, and do you just see different levels of these attitudes in different communities? Probably, I'm probably in one of those communities that has a lot of strong partisans, much more than the general population. Being in the south side of Chicago on a college campus, you get a lot of left-leaning people. I have colleagues and students who probably don't even know anybody who voted for Donald Trump in the last election, and they probably do have a lot of, in their minds, they built up the image of the Trump voter as this kind of irredeemable,
basket of deplorables.
Right. So I'm sure there is some of that. But I don't think it's very common. The vast majority of people, they do live in places with Democrats and Republicans, and their neighbors are both a mix of Democrats and Republicans. So I don't think it's very common, just descriptively, but it probably is common. It's more common on college campuses. It's more common if you're a journalist. If you're a congressional staffer, for example, you spend almost all of your time talking to people on your political side and villainizing the other side. So it's common among a certain set of people who are very influential in our society and our culture and our politics. But I don't think it's very common in general. If you just go to your regular, suburban dinner party, you'll find a lot of people a mix of Democrats and Republicans, and they get along perfectly fine.
I think what is a challenge of the study of political science is this immeasurable group, which are the people who would never, respond to a survey like this, that are a large number of people who are not thinking about this at all, who could not tell you 5 characteristics of a Republican and 5 characteristics of a Democrat. And let alone tell me the spectrum of ideology and what are the nuances there. And I'm convinced that group of people is really, really growing. The people who are, giving so much of their attention to short form videos that are not considering these topics at all. And the more I ask my students every day on the first day of class, describe the government in just a word. And I always get the C words. It's confusing, it's chaotic, it's corrupt.
Yeah,
but I never get interesting, something worth pursuing, something I care to learn more about. I say, how many of you are taking this class because you have to? And they all raise their hands. And I joke with them, well, that's job security for me. So you're not hurting my feelings. But this wildly disengaged group who finds it so unpalatable that if anything, they want to run away as fast as they can from this topic at all. So to try to measure their feelings about the other party, they're like, what feelings? I don't want to be part of this.
Yeah. Right. They're completely unplugged.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Before we leave this question of polarization, I did want to give you a chance to talk about your paper where you looked at partisan constituencies on congressional polarization. What was the fundamental question you were looking at, and what did you find?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that back up. And it's going to sound like I'm going to contradict some of what I said earlier, which is one of the interesting findings in that paper is something I think really, really, really interesting and important, which is the typical member of Congress is increasingly representing a co-partisan constituency. That's a big trend. It used to be the case that your typical senator would represent a state that was about 2 percentage points more favorable toward their party than the rest of the country was. And now that number is about 8 percentage points. And the comparable numbers in the House, I think it went from something like 7 or 8 percentage points to 15 percentage points, something like that. So there's been a pretty big change over the last 50 years or so, where it seems like just your typical congressional district is becoming more partisan. And the paper was largely just motivated by that observation, which I found to be striking, and there hadn't been much discussion of that in the academic literature. So I thought that must be interesting. That must have a lot of interesting implications. I'm trying to understand both what are the effects of that and what are the causes of that. And on the effects side, I looked at congressional roll call voting, and I found that indeed members of Congress cast more extreme polarized votes when they're representing a more partisan constituency. Most of that comes from selection, not from incentive. So it's not that the same person. It's not that Joe Manchin would in fact become much more extreme if somehow West Virginia became more Democratic. It's that if West Virginia became more Democratic, it would elect somebody different than Joe Manchin. And so that's one part of the paper, is just kind of quantifying how much is this contributing to polarization. It turns out a lot. I think you can explain something on the order of 40 to 50% of the increase in congressional polarization from this trend whereby the constituencies are becoming more partisan. And then I also tried to understand what's causing that rise in partisan constituencies. One possibility is geographic polarization, where for whatever reason, just the cities are becoming more Democratic and the suburban and rural areas are becoming more Republican. Another potentially related explanation is what you might call nationalized voting, which is maybe I'm just less informed about what's going on in congressional politics, and whichever way I lean, say in general, that's the way I'm going to vote across all the elections. And both of those could create the same phenomenon. And it turns out it is a mix of both, but it's mostly the geographic polarization story. So for whatever reason, there has been this dramatic change where the cities are becoming more Democratic, the suburban and rural areas are becoming more Republican. I don't think that's because people themselves are particularly extreme or partisan. So even within those cities, even if I go to San Francisco, where I have almost all Democratic voters, those people are not as extreme as their elected officials. They would prefer a $12 minimum wage, not a $50 minimum wage, which Barbara Lee said she wanted, right? So there are some interesting, there's an interesting paradox there, which is the polarization is being driven by increasingly partisan constituents, even though most voters are not happy about this. But there are enough voters who are, you go to these Democratic constituencies, they lean a little bit left, and the elites are so far apart. They think I'm never going to vote for a Republican, right? Like, why, that would be, I'd have to really, really hate my Democratic elected official to switch sides. And that creates an extra incentive for those elected officials to just do more of whatever they want, do more of what their party leaders want. You get more extreme people running for office to begin with. So I think all of those things are related. I haven't answered all the interesting questions, obviously, but I find those trends to be fascinating.
Really, do you think that a move towards having more elected positions, especially in like state and local governments, to be nonpartisan positions themselves, where they don't have to declare a political party, that would lead to more outcomes where people are more satisfied and less polarized on that area? Like, I think about like our local mayor position is nonpartisan, right, and he's got like a 73% approval rating despite doing more progressive things than you would expect out of a typical leader in a really conservative state like Oklahoma. It seems like
nobody shows up in nonpartisan elections is the downside of that. And maybe that's not a downside. I think there's always this tension. Do you want lots of people voting and participating, or do you want, what I hear a lot of people say, oh, we want knowledgeable people voting. And I think you can interpret that as, we want people who agree with me voting. And if you're not, we want you staying home. Right. But you look at turnout in mayoral elections, school board elections that are nonpartisan as well. Nobody shows up and votes in those. And I'm wondering if the lack of partisanship also produces a lack of drive to get people to show up at the polls. I don't know. What do you think, Anthony, about that?
Yeah, those are great trade. I agree with that. Those are fascinating trade-offs. I think Shannon, you're probably right that there would be less polarization if there were more nonpartisan offices. I guess one anecdote we have is that the Nebraska state legislature is nonpartisan. It's a unicameral, nonpartisan body that I think is less polarized than the other state legislatures are. There are, of course, trade-offs there. And of course, you could still go to the Nebraska and find there are liberals and conservatives. And there are a lot of people saying, even though I can't put it on the ballot, trust me, I'm really a Republican and so forth. So there's still a lot of that going on. But I think probably taking away power from the official party institutions would probably be a good thing for reducing polarization. In Illinois, it is almost impossible to even get on the ballot if you're not endorsed by one of the major parties. And as a result, in the Illinois state legislature, there are a bunch of current members of the Illinois state legislature who have never once had to win an election. They have never been contested in even a primary or a general. Even when they ran for the first time, they were uncontested in both the primary and the general. I mean, it's just an amazing, like, at some point you'd say, like, that's not even a democracy. Like, at what point would you say we don't have a democracy because there's no competition in these places? So that's a problem. And I think if you took away some of the official power of the parties, you at least solve some of that. You get reasonable, moderate people who would say, oh, maybe I'd like to run for office, and they'd get on the ballot and so forth. So these are hard problems to solve.
Agreed. Shifting gears a little bit, I don't know if you know this or not, but Oklahoma is a big college football state. Very little curling in Oklahoma, a lot of college football. We love our teams, and our fan bases have really high expectations. You and a colleague did a study that was published in the Journal of Politics a couple of years ago that assessed research indicating that the outcomes of college football games can influence electoral results. What did your study find, and how does it demonstrate the importance of research design methodology to accurately answer questions such as this?
Yeah, so I have two papers on this topic, both of which are responding to other people's papers. But there are these very prominent claims that college football games influence elections. The specific claim is that when the home team wins in the run up to a major election, the incumbent party performs better. And the purported explanation is that people are just in a good mood. Voters are generally kind of incompetent and irrational, and they're just happy. They're in a good mood, and they don't know if they're in a good mood because Oklahoma State just won the last game, or because the governor's doing a good job, and they think, okay, like maybe the governor's doing a good job, and they vote for the governor at a higher rate. And upon reexamination, my view is that that's probably not true. It's probably, if there is an effect of college football games, it's probably substantively negligible. And the previous findings were probably just chance false positives. And one way that I was able to assess that was I said, okay, we've got these regressions. They show an effect. The design looks fine. Actually, the design looks like a sensible design, but this is also the kind of result that would have only been published if it went the one way. Nobody would care about the study that says, hey, it turns out college football games don't affect elections. We can't do a pure replication. We can't go back and rerun the last 50 years of college football games and elections. But one thing we can do is we can say, let's test additional hypotheses that should hold if it turns out that this is real. And so one of the things is we leverage cases like Oklahoma. We say there are some places that care a lot more about college football than others. If this is a genuine finding, it should be stronger in Oklahoma. It should be stronger in Eugene, Oregon. It should be stronger in Alabama. And it should be almost non-existent in Cook County, Illinois. I don't even know whether Northwestern is playing, let alone whether they've won, nor would that affect my mood. But I'm in the data set. Cook County is in the data set, and Northwestern is supposed to apparently influence the voting in Cook County. And it turns out that the finding is mostly driven by places like Northwestern and Boston College. And it is actually, if anything, it actually goes the opposite direction than expected in other places. So I think most likely, and we have a bunch of other tests in the paper, but we have tests like that, and all of them seem to suggest this is probably just one of these chance false positives. It also doesn't hold up in the NFL. The NFL is about 10 times as popular as college football on average. We don't see the same pattern there. Since that paper was published, there have been some people have gone back and collected more data from subsequent elections. There haven't been a lot of subsequent elections, but when you look at the new data from new elections, it's further consistent with the idea that probably there's nothing going on. And this was probably just a chance false positive. It was a fun idea. It was a clever idea. It was a clever design, but probably it's not real, which also gives me some reassurance that voters aren't as naive and incompetent and irrational as people sometimes like to think.
I used to think that I didn't think that the outcome of college football games would impact elections, but I thought being a college football player gave a candidate an advantage in a state like Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And the classic example of that, it would be like J.C. Watts, right? Mm-hmm. And so famous football player from the 70s and early 80s at OU, who went on to have a career in politics here in Oklahoma. But really he's the only one. I mean, Bud Wilkinson, famous coach from the 50s and 60s, ran for governor, didn't win. We had a football player in the recent past, in the last couple of years, who ran for state senate, didn't win, or state house. So it doesn't. I'm beginning to rethink that even that maybe if you're a superstar athlete, you might get a little bit of an advantage, but just
maybe
for
things people infer about you, like leadership, teamwork,
right.
You're strong. When I was reading over this paper, I was thinking about, we are Oklahoma State. I don't say we're fans. I say things like we're graduates, because there's a difference, thumbing my nose at people. But our Governor Stitt, he did this thing, which I think there could be an interesting study. What he did is he came to our game and he sponsored like the Folds of Honor recognition of a service member, and their family comes on the field. And so when he was a candidate, he would come out to every game and he had sponsored it. And so there's so much there. There's military, who everybody in a 50,000 person stadium is going to stand up and clap. Who's not going to clap for the military? And you also have this audience there that is probably some of your more likely voters, right? You're going to have people that probably attended college, that are probably of an income level that they have enough disposable income to do things like attend football games. Like if you're having a targeted audience here, that might be the smartest thing a person could do in a local election, to try to have a captive audience when people are tired of the news and how biased they think it is. And they say, well, that must be a really nice person. They sponsored that plaque to give to a service member. I was like, that's kind of genius. And I would also note that haven't seen him on the field since after the election.
Go figure.
Yeah, my guess is it probably does help, just the fame and notoriety of being a prominent athlete. I'm sure it helps your political career, but you're probably right. The effect is not massive. It's easy to think of Gerald Ford was a great athlete who probably it helped his rise to prominence that he was a great athlete. Bill Bradley, you can think of people like that who were great athletes who went on to political careers and probably wouldn't have otherwise if not for that prominence. Our current president was a television celebrity first and foremost. And he's obviously good at, he's a really good television celebrity. People are drawn to him for whatever reason, and that obviously helps his political career. Do voters put too much weight on that relative to other things? I don't know, but that would be interesting. That would be interesting to study.
Let's talk about civic duty voting. You were part of a project that studied this and produced a report, I think in 2020. Can you explain what's meant by civic duty voting and what was the recommendations in that report?
Sure. The recommendation is that we should think of voting as a civic duty and think of voting as a collective action problem, which is none of us individually has a strong incentive to vote, but collectively we're all better off if everybody votes. And so therefore we should run voting in the same way that we run other collective action problems, right? None of us want to pay our taxes, but it's good for the country if we all pay our taxes. And so we incentivize people to pay their taxes. You can go to prison if you don't pay your taxes. We incentivize you to properly dispose of your trash and so forth. And so the proposal was we should fine people for not voting, which sounds kind of extreme and punitive. But the idea is, and the fines, of course, would be relatively modest, but the idea is voting is important. It's an important thing. If everyone does it, our democracy collectively is better off if everybody does it. And so we should incentivize it in the same way that we incentivize other kinds of collective actions. So that was the recommendation. The fine, in our recommendation, the fine would be reasonably modest. You would, there could be lots of defensible, forgivable excuses for not voting, if you're sick, if you're traveling, and so forth. But the idea is to implement something like a compulsory voting law, which they have in lots of other countries, to get much higher levels of turnout, higher levels of participation, better representation. And it probably would have lots of other benefits as well. You'd have people that would become more informed because they're voting. You'd probably have a lot of those moderates and independents who otherwise stay at home voting, which could potentially reduce polarization and some of the ugly rancor that you see in our political system. So that was the proposal. Pulling it, will it actually get implemented? I don't know, but we decided to put it out there as something for us to seriously talk about. We discussed a lot of the relevant political science research on this, and we thought it was worth talking about.
Shanna kind of alluded to this earlier. There's always in state like Oklahoma. So Oklahoma is like in the bottom 10 It may have been like number 49 of the 50 states in turnout. And so there's all sorts of proposals about how we can boost turnout. And and every time I hear people talking about that, I just think back to that. And I'm like, there's a really easy way to increase turnout. Just make it mandatory.
How do you feel as a libertarian?
It rankles my libertarian, cackles just a little bit. But if that's the main priority, now that's always the question. What is the main, what are the considerations? What are the elements of an electoral system that you want to consider? Turnout, obviously, in a democratic system is one of those. I think there are other factors that are also important. Things like the ability of partisans to organize and advocate for candidates of their choice. Does the system produce candidates that are actually representative of the largest body of who is electing them? So that representation, so there are other elements that I think are important. Sometimes I think those can come into conflict with each other. And so what's the most important? I don't know. There's probably some optimum level where you can get a balance of them. But for people who are just like, we need more people voting, there's a simple answer to that. I think their problem is there are too many people like me. It's like, you can't make me vote.
Who wants to be the party that champions this? And so people are voting against the party that made them turn out to vote.
But I do think making this, and the report does this, kind of making this connection to jury duty, right? We make people serve jury duty.
That's true.
And I don't know that this is a lot different than that. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, Anthony, but I think there was a provision in that, like, you could show up at the poll and mark your ballot and just not vote for anybody, but you came there and you were there. And so it wouldn't necessarily compel people to vote for candidates that they didn't want to vote for, but they had to participate in some way. Is that right?
That's right. That's important. Yes, you're not obligated to vote for any particular candidate. You're free to vote however you want, including none of the above. So there would be a none of the above option. And for people who really were unhappy with the choices on offer in, say, this last presidential election, of which there were many, I think that might have been a good thing in and of itself to actually have that on record, to have a bunch of people who showed up at the polls and say, I don't like any of the candidates, or maybe I like this third party candidate. Maybe, James can vote for Chase Oliver. And even though Chase Oliver was not going to win, he can express his support for Chase Oliver. And maybe Chase Oliver gets 15% of the vote, and and Jill Stein gets 7%, and so on, and you get to see just how much dissatisfaction there is with both of the major parties.
I didn't get to review this specific paper before today, but I assume that this stems from like the Downesian economic theories of democracy, with that duty is really the thing that compels people to vote, because the cost of voting is really irrational. If you consider like all the variables that go into, I have to take off work, or I have to drive there, or I don't get anything out of this election. I don't perceive that I do. So that sense of duty is what largely compels people to turn out to vote. But I wonder if removing institutional barriers to voting, like the day that we vote, or having mail voting, where we see a lot of very high turnout for states that do permit mailer voting, if those would have similar outcomes to requiring people to vote, if it was just not so institutionally difficult for people to be able to cast their vote.
I mean, I think the evidence is in on that, and the answer is no. I mean, we have tried a ton of these reforms, and all of these little reforms, whether it's weekend voting, same-day registration, mail-in voting, et cetera, they often do have very modest effects. Maybe each of those reforms gets another 1% of people voting, and that's not a bad thing to do. We should, of course, make it easier for people to vote, as long as our elections are secure and all of that. So those aren't bad things to do, but they do not get anywhere near the level of participation that you would get with a compulsory voting system. And I think that's for an obvious reason, which is, like you said, it is not rational as an individual to vote in a large election. The chances that my vote is going to be pivotal in a large gubernatorial election, let's say, is maybe it's 1 in 50 million or something in expectation. Like, that's not worth it for me to turn out to vote. A lot of people do make this argument that, if they don't want to vote, maybe, why do we want them voting anyway? And my reaction is, it's not rational for any of you people to be voting. And so what we have is governance by the people who just happen to like voting as a hobby. And that doesn't seem fair. There's no intrinsic argument that that's what's better for democracy. Unfortunately, I think it doesn't do enough to just make it easier for people to vote. The only way to get anything even remotely close to universal participation is some incentive to vote.
My libertarian. This is where. So we had a conversation with another political scientist not too long ago, and he was talking about how he's conflicted sometimes because his research as a political scientist doesn't always neatly line up with like his ideological and political leanings.
Sounds like he's probably a good researcher then.
Yeah, right. And I'm sitting here thinking might be one of those times where my libertarian priors might not match up well with what the evidence shows, right? So I'm going to have to reconcile that some way.
I know that you're focused on political science research, but I'm going to ask you to put on the hat of a pundit for a minute. What over the next few years do you see happening that may shape our democratic system for years to come? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about American democracy?
I'm going to try to mostly keep my political science hat on here and say that I am, as a political scientist, generally optimistic about American democracy. I think the voters are not as partisan or irrational or misinformed as people think. They seem to respond reasonably to the competence of the candidates, the ideologies of the candidates. They create incentive for elected officials to work hard and do a good job. And when elected officials do a bad job, they get voted out of office most of the time. So I think so that all of those things make me optimistic about democracy, or at least say, democracy is the best of all of the bad systems that we could design. There are still lots of things to worry about, and we've already talked about some of them already, which are, the kinds of people who run for office are mostly extremists. They don't necessarily, they might be out of touch. They might be selfish and corrupt and so forth. There are lots of unelected bureaucrats who also are not very accountable to the public, that might also not have the best interests of the public in mind and so forth. And a lot of the constituencies are partisan, like we talked about. And so even if the voters themselves aren't happy with the current state of affairs, there may not be a very strong electoral incentive for the officials to really work hard and do a good job because the voters aren't going to switch and vote for the other party. So there are things to worry about with our democratic system, but I'm not more worried now than I was, 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I think democracy as an institution has done a pretty good job for the United States. And I'm mostly optimistic for those reasons.
We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.
Well, what's next on your research agenda? What questions are pressing that you're going to try to answer here in the short term?
I continue to be interested in some of these same questions. I'm studying both voter behavior and elite behavior, thinking about the interactions of the two. I have one current project about the incentive effects of primary elections. Do primary elections exacerbate polarization like people think? I have one current project on redistricting. To what extent does partisan redistricting exacerbate polarization? And I think there's some consensus among political scientists that redistricting doesn't explain very much, and I think they're missing something interesting there. So that's something I'm excited to study. I'm interested in the fact that we tend to see more polarization in closely divided legislatures. If I look at state legislatures that are in purple states where it's kind of up for grabs who the majority party is going to be, we tend to see more polarization. And I'm interested in why that's going on. And so that's something that I'm just thinking about now. I'm also really interested in this recent phenomenon of educational polarization, that college graduates are becoming increasingly Democratic. And the party's bases have shifted pretty dramatically even since 2012. And other political scientists have documented that as well and written a lot about it. But I don't think we've answered all the interesting questions there. I'd be really interested in studying exactly what's going on. Why is that happening? How much of it is because of the platforms of the parties changing? How much of that is it indoctrination at the college level? Are we responsible for this? I think there are a lot of possibilities to explore there.
Can you give us a hint about the types of research you and your co-hosts on Not Another Politics podcast will be interested in exploring?
Yeah, I think we're going to continue to be broadly interested in lots of political topics. One sad bit of news is that Will Howell, one of our co-hosts, just left the University of Chicago. So this is, I guess, happy news for him and for the field. He's going to be the new dean of the brand new public policy school at Johns Hopkins. But that means he's left as a co-host of Another Politics podcast. We'll hope to bring him on every once in a while. But our new co-host is Ethan Buendia-Mesquita. And so just that change will there's going to be a new perspective on the show. We're going to have slightly different topics that we're covering. And Ethan's really interested in things like conflict and counterterrorism. And so we'll probably be covering some of those topics at a higher rate. He's also really interested in these kind of governance and tech questions. And so that the liquid democracy paper I mentioned before, that was one of his ideas to bring that paper on and talk about that. So that'll be fun. But we're pretty open-minded. So send us papers if you think there's something we should be covering. We would love to hear it.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, our guest today has been Dr. Antony Fowler, professor of public policy at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And I'm just going to say, I want to be Antony when I grow up.
Yeah, me too.
That's just it. I know he's a lot younger than I am, but he's been in academia longer than I have. And so I can say
definitely
that.
Pursuing some really interesting research.
Yes. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for coming on. Wish you the best. And you absolutely will be listening to Not Another Politics podcast as well.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Great to talk to you. This was fun. And I'd love to have you on Another Politics podcast sometime. That'll be fun.
Very cool.
This is Deborah, the resident Gen Z member of the Not My Generation podcast family. Not My Generation is produced in the Possibilities Inc. studio. This episode was produced by Lauren Peaches Keller. It was edited by Santiago Ramones. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Send a voice memo to notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu and you could hear your voice on an upcoming episode. If you liked today's episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and sharing the podcast with others. You can check out previous episodes on any podcast app and on our podcast website at notmygeneration.captivate.fm, where we also provide our show notes. And remember, you can follow Not My Generation on X, formerly known as Twitter, at NMG Podcast, and on Facebook at Not My Generation Podcast. We look forward to interacting with you soon.